Then Dr. Valentina OKARU-BISANT. Of course, most of you who have seen her participate in other talks, you know that she has over 10 years of teaching. She has a high-level experience in business, trade, and economic development. She has over 14 years in business and scholarly publication and sits on the board of several organizations. She participates as a presenter and a moderator in many high-level business conferences, such as this one. She's a USA and Nigerian trained attorney. She is also a graduate of London School of Economics, the Stanford University Law School, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So please do not hold that against her.
Thank you.
Fantastic. But so I will step aside and allow her to set the context for this wonderful discussion. And I am here just to kind of ensure that individuals are mindful of the time and to assist the moderator in that regard. So thank you again.
Thank you. And first, we have a distinguished panelists, and I'm going to, in the interest of saving time, I'm going to have them briefly introduce themselves. And after the introduction, then I'm going to just give a brief overview of the structure of this session, and then we'll have a Q&A after each panelist, distinguished panelist, presents the section of what they're going to be talking about. Okay. So first, I want to introduce you to Larry Freeman, and he will just briefly give an introduction of, in terms of a bio as to who he is, just in 2 sentences. And then after that, I'll introduce you to our next distinguished panelist, Joyce Williams, who will also just introduce herself. And then I will give a brief overview, like I said earlier, of what we're going to be discussing and the structure of this session. Okay.
I'm happy to be here today. My name is Lawrence Freeman. I've been involved in economic development policy in Africa for the last 30 years, working with governments and institutions and promoting policy in the interest of economic growth. And I established my own website a couple of years ago, Lawrence Freeman Africa in the World. I have several.com, and I have several hundred articles there on economic development and growth perspective. So I will share some of that information with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And Joyce?
My name is Joyce Williams. I'm a practicing attorney here in the DC area, and my practice focus is on immigration, project finance, and international trade. I have worked at the UN, the International Law Institute, and I currently have my own practice in Duke Street, Alexandria.
Wonderful. So you see, we have two very distinguished panelists today that are going to be discussing the question of challenges and opportunities in Africa Continental Free Trade Area. First, what is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? Before we jump into that, it's an agreement between signatories to the trade agreement. It's a regional trade agreement, the first of its kind. It came into effect in June 2019, not long ago actually. It's not been fully operationalized. And it came into effect after Gambia became the 22nd country to ratify it. Okay, and that's really exciting for Africa, really. It's a game changer, and it's the goal is to create a single and inclusive and integrated market for 1.2 billion Africans to engage in intra-trade in goods and services. This is really very critical. And what's the value of the goods they're talking about here? Over $2 trillion in terms of GDP is what they're predicting, right? So what are the other goals that are linked to this goal? It wants to create, the agreement wants to create an integrated, inclusive, single market. When we talk about inclusiveness, what are they talking about? What was the goal of creating inclusiveness? It's about having, including the youth and of course women in economic development, because the youth have been left behind, okay? So why do we have a problem right now in Africa in terms of challenges? We have a problem, and we're going to be addressing 2 of the 3 main challenges, because our speakers are going to be talking about 2 of them. The 3 main challenges to implementing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement are addressing the infrastructure challenges, the human capital, in other words, the inclusiveness goal that they want, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area wants to achieve, and then the 3rd one is the competitiveness of the SMEs, and that's linked to the manufacturing sector, okay? So in terms of infrastructure, it's really very easy to go from, say, South Africa to England than to go from South Africa to, say, Nigeria, okay? Because currently, and it's not for us to sound like we're all about doomsday, right? Because it's a reality. But let's face it, a lot of progress has been made, as Larry will be discussing, you know, a lot of progress, be it utilizing Chinese assistance or USA and, you know, aid agencies and all. But there's still a lot more to be done in Africa with respect to the infrastructural challenges. Okay, now as to the second challenge, the human capital, the inclusiveness question. Currently, we know, it's undisputed, that 60% of Africa's youth are unemployed. And what are we talking about in terms of demographics of Africa's youth? 19% of the 1.1 billion people in Africa currently are youth. In other words, youth between ages 15 and 24. 19%, and by my calculations, that comes to 226 million of the 1.1 billion people in Africa currently unemployed. That's serious business. And the predictions are that by 2030, youth will comprise 42% of over 1.2 billion people. So when you factor that into the problem of 60% unemployment amongst that youth, that is chaos about to happen. Some people say there'll be a revolution, whatever you want to call it, amongst the Africans, because right now you have high crime, you have a situation with Boko Haram and terrorists all over Africa, and they're easily being recruited by terrorists because there's a high unemployment rate. So we have an issue of unemployment, underemployment, and unskilled, which is also exacerbated by the good news of automation and artificial intelligence, which is what we're moving at. This is the 4th industrial revolution, and of course xenophobia, which has kicked in as a response to that. So there's a 3rd challenge of SME, okay, improving competitiveness. But we're not going to be tackling that, because in the interest of time, we're going to just tackle the infrastructural challenges and how to turn them into opportunities, because we don't want to leave here, you know, with napkins or whatever, sobbing about the doomsday of Africa. So we have distinguished panelists that will be talking about turning those challenges. Larry will be discussing how to turn the infrastructural challenges into opportunities. And then Joyce will be talking about the human capital challenge and the link to xenophobia, and of course the problems of unskilled labor, unemployment, and underemployment of our youth in Africa. Okay, so with that, I pass it on to Larry.
Thank you very much. If we look at Africa today and we look at the challenges, they are quite significant. However, none of them are insurmountable. And the question of infrastructure really is at the core of dealing with both the economic difficulties, poverty, malnutrition, infant mortality, as well as dealing with the question of training enormous amount of youth labor that's going to be expanding in Africa over the years ahead. Both the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the African Union's Agenda 2063, both of those documents recognize the absolute essential need of expanding infrastructure. And therefore, the question is, how and what are our priorities in this area are very much on the agenda for Africa today. When we look at the question, if you look at the continent as a whole, you can take a picture, I use it in my history classes on African history, you can see from the nighttime sky, there's no lights in Africa relative to the rest of the world. And that itself is a damning reality, the lack of infrastructure. If you look at the continent as a whole, very small pockets around South Africa, North Africa, around the Maghreb, and then around Nigeria, the Bight of Benin. Also, if you look at it from any other standpoint, if you look at the amount of rail that exists in Africa, rail lines, kilometers of rail is minuscule. You measure kilometers of rail by the length of the rail divided by the square area of the country. And it almost doesn't register in most countries, the amount of rail. This is true with roads and other areas. But if we just take those two areas themselves, this is quite a significant challenge. The question, though, of looking at infrastructure, there's two immediate applications for Africa. One is, and this is a historical fact of infrastructure, is it adds economic value to your economy. Infrastructure increases the productive capability of your economy to produce more wealth for more people. It increases the growth rate because it adds, by infrastructure, you're adding a new technology that surrounds your system of production. So every worker, every farmer becomes more productive by the implementation and increasing the density of infrastructure surrounding that economic unit. For example, in Africa you have upwards of 40%, not in all cases, of food that rots because you don't have refrigerated railroad cars to move it. And as previous speakers mentioned, you can't get from one part of the country, continent to another. As was mentioned by an earlier speaker, this was absolutely intentional by the Berlin Conference. If you look at every country that was colonized by the French or the British primarily, Nigeria I know well, I spent many weeks and months in Nigeria traveling the country. It was very clear, Lord Lugar made it essential that there would not be infrastructure, just the palm oil to the port of Lagos. And that's fairly typical. That was fairly typical in Kenya when the British came in. That was the case all over. So if you look down from the top, there's no east-west railroad in Africa. There's no north-south railroad, although there are some north-south roads being built. There are east-west roads being built. But if you look at the essential qualities, energy, it is not possible to have an industrialized manufacturing society unless you have abundant energy and you have access to energy. And I think we all know that you have approximately over 600 million people living in Africa without access to electricity. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have 100,000 megawatts for 1 billion people. Absurd. And 40,000 comes from South Africa. So you can't run an economy without energy. Rail lines, connecting major cities, capitals, and ports by rail revolutionizes your economy. There have been major studies done in our own country. It was people like Henry Carey, Friedrich List, saw the value of railroads because railroads bring in new science, new technology. If you had a railroad running from Port Sudan or Djibouti all the way across to Dakar, you would revolutionize all those economies. They would be changed. You'd have power structures along each side of the railroad. You'd have new manufacturing centers. All this is possible. All this is necessary because and when you bring in a new technology, it brings in a new science capability, and a new infrastructure brings in a new science capability, which then can transform the economic mode even to a higher level. So you're dealing with integrated infrastructure platforms that continually advance and change. One of the most, I was very happy to read yesterday morning, or this morning, that Paul Kagame and Rwanda have signed a deal with the Russian nuclear energy industry to have nuclear power plants built in and operating in Rwanda, and talking about 2024, so that's only 5 years away. Egypt has already contracted with the Russians for 4 nuclear power plants producing several thousand megawatts of power. South Africa has been in discussions with both Russia and China on this question. Nuclear power is exactly the new type of infrastructure technology you want for Africa. I mean, not only can one unit supply with 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt, but it gives you a higher form of technology. It gives you more capability. It gives you greater energy flux density. It's ideal for desalination. Right now, I guess most of you are aware, there's a big controversy going on between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Korean Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The Ethiopians are going to build the dam. They have the sovereign right to do it on the Blue Nile. But the Nile is not big enough for the 500 million people who depend on it, much less the next generation. So you have to create a new Nile. You have to create another 80 billion cubic feet of water. You do it by desalination. The best way to desalinate is nuclear energy. So I go on in this area, but this is the direction of progress. In our country, we built our whole country on this conception, from Alexander Hamilton and George Washington up through Abraham Lincoln, through Franklin Roosevelt, through John Kennedy, always seeing the potential of infrastructure to build the United States, from canals to Lincoln's efforts and success in building the railroad even after he was assassinated. The East-West Railroad changed the United States forever and changed the world forever, because all the other great countries, such as Sergei Witte of Prussia and the Russians and everyone else, began copying the railroad. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was built in following the East-West Railroad of the United States. We need railroads crisscrossing Africa. We need hundreds of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail connecting every part of the country, so you can go Cape to Cairo, not for Cecil Rhodes purposes, but for purposes of development. You can go east-west. You can have a trunk line across the Sahara Desert, connecting up to a line along the Maghreb. I produced graphs and information on this. This is where we have to invest. It's the same thing, as I said, with energy. Without investment in these areas, we will not succeed in meeting the requirements of the continent and actually developing its resources, which have not been ever fully developed. They've just been stolen periodically and looted, but they've never been fully developed. If you look on the question of the effects, as the moderator said, on labor, you want to train your labor to learn the next skill level. If you bring in more advanced technologies, then you bring in the capability of more training centers, more educational centers. And so you constantly have an upgrading of your semi-skilled to skilled, your skilled engineers. You have to have a certain portion of your labor involved in scientific research. So you need engineers and scientists, African engineers and scientists doing this. Because then you actually spread knowledge and you enable your people to assimilate new advances and operate them. And this is not new. I don't know if any of you read Chikanta Diop, but he wrote about this in 1960. He wrote a nice little book called The United States of Africa. And he talked about having nuclear energy in Africa then as a training center for youth. Now, the extractive industries, which the West has mainly focused on since independence in the 1960s, do not produce a number of jobs. They are not a job-producing industry. So therefore, we shouldn't focus on them. What we should focus on is building up infrastructure to produce industrialized manufacturing societies. Africa, with 1.2 billion people, has the lowest value added, less than 3% value added in manufacturing goods in world trade. So that's horrible. There are no real strong manufacturing centers in Africa at this moment. So if we want to have jobs for the future, we are losing time by not making these investments now. Val talked about 1.2 billion people and 60% youth. The projections are by 2050, we're going to have 2.5 billion people on the continent, and 1 billion will be youth. So if we don't have jobs, and I'm not talking about makeshift jobs, meaningful, productive jobs, jobs with dignity, jobs where people go out, they earn a living, they get a paycheck, not the informal economy, which is a disaster but a real job with a real paycheck that you can take home and you can buy a house and you can raise a family, so that the children of today's children grow up and they have expectations and they have hope for the future. The biggest problem we're going to have if we don't start this massive investment program now is what is going to happen over these next 30 years when the population doubles. If we don't do what is necessary now and have a mass economic mobilization for economic development built around infrastructure, driven by science and technology, then we're not going to, the problems we have with Boko Haram and all these other groups which feed off of desperation and poverty are going to expand rapidly. And we're not going to be able to control them if they keep expanding. So the fact of the matter is, these are the types of programs that we have to work on. Now, China has taken up the issue of providing infrastructure for Africa. And a lot of people object to it, but frankly, the arguments are false. China has built infrastructure in countries that has changed those countries. I was there in 2016 at the inauguration of the Addis Ababa Djibouti train. I was just reading yesterday that the success of this railroad in bringing fertilizer into Ethiopia from the port of Djibouti has expanded agricultural production in Ethiopia. The standard gauge in Kenya is another area we can see massive expansion. New ports are being built. All these endeavors by the Chinese, which are involving themselves in the future of Africa as assistants and allies, is the exact way we should have gone. The West should have done this 50 years ago, but it refused to, and is still refusing to. We have one example in the last 50 years, since independence, 60 years, of involvement by the President of the United States, involvement in infrastructure. And that was John F. Kennedy's collaboration with Kwame Nkrumah in building the Volta Dam project, which would not have happened because the British were against it. And Kennedy stepped in, and we had that project, and that's the last time we've had an executive officer of the United States involved in building infrastructure in Africa. So if we want to meet the challenges of tomorrow, 30 years from now, we want to deal with the massive expansion, which is good. More people is better. Each child has a creative mind, and that creative mind can make a contribution to the universe. But then we have to work now to actually implement those policies, which are on the table in 2063 agenda, which are on the table in the free trade agreement. But if we don't actually take executive action, we will not meet the needs tomorrow. If we do, then we can see a transformation on the continent. I'm very optimistic. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm going on 69, and I'm confident we can do this if we get commitment from the leaders in Africa and we get assistance from Africa's allies around the rest of the world. And then I think Africa's future will be very bright as we look ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. And after Joyce, capital development issues.
Thank you. So we're talking human capital, and at the beginning of Professor Valentina's introduction, she mentioned how many population of the African continents are in the youth, and she mentioned, I believe, 16% of the population of Africa is in the youth age, and about 60%
yes.
are unemployed.
Yes, of course.
60% are either unemployed or underemployed. So given the number, 16% of the population, but they do have such a high number of unemployment on the continent. So I want to just refer us to the Protocol on Free Movement of People, which was adopted at the AU Summit in January 2018. Currently, I believe it has about 7 to 10 signatories, which is a little bit worrying, given that free movement of people would actually bring some benefits and also engage the continent in addressing youth unemployment and opening the continent up for opportunities for the younger people. So the free movement of people actually came out of the Abuja Treaty of 1991, establishing that the African Economic Community should have free movement of people, rights to establish and to have free access onto in any countries on the continent. 1991, it's a very long time, until 2018, and so the conversation is going on. There are clear benefits of having free movements across borders. I will categorize them under three headings. One, there are security, there is economic, and then there is the health issues that are associated when you're talking about free movement of people. So on the security part, and I think that Mr. Freeman touched a bit on that, you have issues with terrorist activities like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa. So you have concerns about those groups operating through free movement of people on the continent and gaining easy access to other countries on the continent that they typically don't have activities. So the governments in individual countries have legitimate concerns when they talk about security. In terms of health, we just recently saw the crisis with Ebola. For instance, as people move around and across borders, it's natural to carry diseases with them, and you have outbreaks of diseases, and it becomes difficult to control. So those are also legitimate concerns, and as well as the economic, when you have low wages as a result of movements of people, high influx of migrants. Usually they are willing to accept any jobs and just do the work. So with that said, there are also positives, several positive aspects of free movement of people. And if you look at a country like the United States, for instance, with the benefits of immigration, if you look at Silicon Valley, the number of people who comes from other countries to come here, they have been leaders in innovation in several areas, not only in technology, in health, in business, in finance. If you look across all sectors in this country, you will see the benefit of immigration. The same way, if you look across the sectors in Africa and across countries, there are some countries in Africa that has better education system than others. And then you have students from other countries attending universities in those countries. I'm originally from Ghana. I've seen several Nigerian students who have attended either the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology or the University of Ghana. So by having that relationship where students can transfer and go to universities in other countries on the continent, and then return back to their home countries with that knowledge and technology to develop and help the building of their own countries. You have some of the economies on the continent that are very well advanced. You have places like South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, you have even Nigeria, which have special niches in areas that are very well advanced, and you find others traveling into those countries. But the difficulty right now on the continent, as Professor Val alluded to earlier, is the difficulty of moving. If I'm going from Ghana to Nigeria, I should be able to go without a whole lot of problems. And because they're in the ECOWAS community now, with the ECOWAS passports, you're able to travel without having to obtain a visa to go to Nigeria if you're traveling from Ghana. However, if I want to travel to South Africa on a Ghanaian passport, then I need to obtain a visa. It's a tedious process, waiting, the number of days that you are given, and how long he could stay there, and even the cost of flight from Accra to Johannesburg. I recently had a family friend whose wife needed surgery in South Africa, and the flight from Accra to South Africa, Johannesburg, was about $750 US. I can fly from Washington to South Africa, Johannesburg, on the same cost, on return flights back and forth. So it becomes really ridiculous. And then the cost of visa for them to travel to South Africa, and all the documentation process they had to go through to even obtain the visa in order to be able to go to South Africa. So when we are looking at free movement of people on the continent, we are looking at all these issues. How do we, as one people on the continent, be able to secure border, to take to address issues of security, to put in place measures and frameworks that address the economic issues that comes with migration and the health issues, but at the same time not prevent each other from being able to move across the continent, because there are different skills, there are different abilities, and the economies goes up and down. If you take United States, for instance, there are some economies that at sometimes they're doing well, at sometimes places like Detroit, the economy wasn't doing well. People are able to move to another state so easily, start over, and then as Detroit starts to pick up, other people are also moving from other states and going there, taking advantage of that. And so that is what we want to see on the continent, where we erase the boundaries that we have put in place, or the division that resulted as a result of colonization, but move beyond that and have remove those imaginary borders and encourage that if I'm from Ghana and I have trained and there are opportunities in Rwanda that fits my training, I should be able to apply for employment in Rwanda without having any big challenges into moving into Rwanda. The conversation on free movement of people and head of states flip-flops on the issue at different times depending on who you are talking to or what the situation looks like. Currently we have issues with Sudan and Libya, for instance, closing their border as a result of security issue. You have Kenya and Somalia. You have Nigeria, who has concern about smuggling of goods, so they have shut their borders until they figure out a way that they can control that. Meanwhile, there will be high cost of produce and goods as a result of this border shut. You have Rwanda and DRC for health reasons because of Ebola. And then you have Ethiopia and Eritrea that just opened their borders recently. The Ethiopian president won the Nobel for that, and the problems are resurfacing again. You see many African youth have the same ability and the same opportunities to be innovative in the ways that their counterparts overseas in other developed nations are. So not only to open borders, but also to open access for these young people on the continent to have that freedom to express themselves, to be innovative without the fear of failing or no safety network. So a partnership between governments and youth entities on the continent becomes very important. Addressing issues in universities, curriculums that actually empowers them and prepares them for the next level is very important. About a year or two, I was judging a moot court competition, arbitration moot court competition in one of the universities here in Washington, D.C. And we had students coming from all over the place, different countries, almost about 35 different countries represented. And we had a group that came from one of the East African countries. And their briefs were really well done. They had written an excellent brief, but their oral presentation was really bad. And it wasn't because English is not their first language. And after I spoke to the students and I said, you guys had really good arguments. You have nice brief written, what is the issue? And it's, well, preparation. We don't have coaches to coach us. We didn't have preparation, so we were bouncing off each other to train ourselves. So universities on the continent needs to take into account all of those things, because if you're sitting across your counterparts from other countries, you need to have the same confidence to articulate what you have in mind. If you are at negotiation tables, you should be confident to be able to express yourself and your thoughts the same way, without any fear or having to limit yourself because you think that the other person has better advantage over you. Because if you come down to it, it's not. It's not. And then one of the biggest issues that we've seen on the continent too is that prejudice against each other. And this is fueled all by, the economics of things, job losses, violence. And so we saw in South Africa where people are saying, oh, Nigerians are taking our jobs, they are opening shops, they are taking our market. But there is an opportunity for dialogue and partnership in that sense, if we can see ourselves as we are equal and we all want the same thing, and we want to create an equal and accessible common market for each African to be a participant in it. Because if a South African is thinking, I can't go to Nigeria and reap these benefits, so how come a Nigerian can come to South Africa and reap this benefit? Then it starts to create that, no, it's me and we are against these people, or these people against us. But if we have that equality of market access among countries on the continent, then issues like xenophobia can be reduced. I mean, there's more that goes into xenophobia than just economics, but you start to have a conversation from that standpoint, and it begins to decrease because we begin to see ourselves as, what I'm doing here in country A, I can go to country B and do the same thing. Or people from country B can come to country A and do the same thing. And the benefits and the opportunities are innumerable. It's not a zero-sum game. It is it is rather a win-win situation for parties that are participating. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll just continue.
Yes, thank you, Joyce and Larry, for Joyce addressed the human capital challenges and also the opportunities, how to turn those challenges into opportunities. And of course, Larry addressed infrastructural challenges and how to turn them into opportunities. But let me just break down a little bit or summarize and then ask you a question from your presentation. First, I'll start with you, Larry, because I know you looked at creating, you didn't use the word, but transformational economy.
Correct.
That's what you're looking at, a transformational economy that incorporates development of nuclear power and using it as opposed to water, because as you know, with the Ethiopia-Egypt saga right now, that they've been going back and forth. Water is, of course, some people say it doesn't deplete, but it's as Ishmael Sharageldon, when I worked at the World Bank years ago, said, the war of this century, the 21st century, will be over water, because water is going to be increasingly scarce and everything. But having said that, I like that idea of having to have various options, diversifying energy sources for Africa, not just zeroing in only on water, but now that coal is seen as a deadly weapon, because with the climate change, nuclear is cleaner. But then there are security issues or implications, at least from the developed countries. They're sometimes concerned about the nuclear power plant option, because, of course, I've read up on that and I've followed closely that sometimes some of the materials that are used to develop nuclear power plants can also be used by some countries to move on to develop a nuclear. And of course, you know, with nuclear proliferation and the move to not move in that direction by, of course, the group of 7 or group of 8, what are you going to recommend to African nations with respect to addressing this question of, if they're going to go that route of developing nuclear power plants, what are the kind of challenges they'll face from a geopolitical standpoint in terms of security, questions that some Western nations might raise within that context? You're familiar with that issue, right?
Of course.
Yes. And then secondly, on your presentation too, the issue of China, because I know you mentioned the capital. Of course, financing is always a big thing, right, with infrastructure, be it roads or energy. Capital is, when we talk about factors of production, affordability always kicks in, right? Because when you can't have an economy with, it's just simple economics 101. Land, labor, infrastructure. That's what we're talking about here. You can't move the AFCTA forward without making sure you have affordable factors of production for Africa. Now, the question becomes, does Africa really need China to help it with capital costs in terms of the funding? Or does it need China and other countries with respect to more technical know-how, transfer of technology, and of course, your reference to utilizing the youth in terms of vocational training and all, but how do you strike that balance between all the needs and demands that Africa has? It's endless, so that's for you. But let me also ask her, then I'll throw it out there. I have two questions for you. So now for Joyce, these are really distinguished speakers. I'm very impressed with them, so this is wonderful. So yeah, on the movement of, free movement of people, as you put it, it's been in the books since the 90s, before the AFCTA. And we have still not, we, meaning the African nations, have not come together to get their act together to move this forward, because the AFCTA is about goods and services, right? And then you have the protocols. You have the protocols on goods, you have the protocol on services, and you have that free movement of peoples, which was actually a precursor. It came before the AFCTA, which was, of course, as I said earlier, came into force in 2019. So what is it about African nations? What is it about us Africans that we have this xenophobic attitude? But mind you, it's not unique to Africa, because we talk about Brexit in Britain, right, with the isolationist movement, and we have somebody in the White House here that has pockets of people that support the so-called isolationist movement, even within the US. And then we have it sweeping all over, not just Britain and the US, but it's sweeping all over Europe, right? And then we have it also in Africa. But then in African context, it's called xenophobia. But I see it as one and the same thing. It doesn't have to be white on black or black on, it's the same thing. It's what I call the isolationist, nationalist movement. My brother is shaking his head. Jack Rogers, yeah, sister, go, right, preach. That's right, that's what I'm doing, preaching. So it's really the same. So now, weaving that in, how do we reconcile? And I know you mentioned, the opportunities for sort of like engaging African governments, in terms of diplomatic relations with each other, improving. You mentioned the challenges of economic, health, and security, because these are the drivers, and how we should address those. But it seems like, when you take the case of what happened with South Africa, it wasn't just even Nigeria. Nigeria had actually, years ago, you're my friend, where I'm a Nigerian American and you're Ghanaian American. Ooh. Remember what happened with Nigeria? The Ghana Must Go, which was years ago. I was little. Oh, I'm so young. I want to talk about how young I was at that time. But it was about 20, 30, I don't know how many years ago. And then Ghana, it wasn't so much retaliation, but Ghana also did the same and claimed it was 419 or security concerns that made them, and this just happened barely a couple of months ago. So the question is, how do we reconcile this so-called isolationist nationalist movement with the free trade policies that are being propagated or espoused under the AFCTA at the continental level? Because yes, we have to address the inequities at the national level, right, in terms of job creation and everything that you mentioned, vocational training for youth. It also has a national, state level, and then national level, and at the regional level. How do how should countries handle this, given the exigencies of geopolitics and, of course, the whole diplomatic strategies that countries tend to use to resolve these kinds of problems? Okay, so that's basically the questions I have. And just one other thing, we didn't discuss SMEs, but SMEs are very, very critical to resolving some of the problems that we're talking about today. Because as you know, the manufacturing sector comprises only 10% of total GDP, but SMEs provide more than 80% of employment in Africa as a whole. So it's a very, very important subject which we didn't really have time to discuss, but really it's woven into our conversation is the need for youth, and women to be employed, in a very competitive SME market, because terrain, because this African Continental Free Trade Area was actually intended to promote more competitiveness within the SME, formal and informal sector. But what you have, as Larry mentioned earlier, is an extractive economy that Africa has, where you don't have value-added products, that are traded amongst Africans.
And low employment.
That's right. So most of the products are actually raw materials that are exported. Cocoa, coffee. That is what we have, an economic climate of mostly raw materials. We have a lot of work to do. But the challenges always create opportunities. So now we have the opportunity to use our youth in not just the SME sector and women, and of course, not to leave men need to be involved too, in creating a more competitive market that would include, in terms of inclusiveness, which is one of the goals of the AFCTA, include youth, women, and unemployed youth. But the second question linked to that is automation and the impact of automation on youth. So I have 2 questions for you and 2 questions for Larry. Yes, you want to start first, Larry?
Well, I would say, first of all, the nuclear energy is going ahead. It just should go much faster than it is, but it's not going to be stopped. You see the geopolitical questions that are brought up. The Western capitals, France, Britain, United States, Germany lost it completely. Italy is the best one at this moment. They've all become, they have a very pessimistic culture right now. We have a pessimistic culture in the United States. So they don't believe in looking 20, 40 years ahead to development. As a result, 75% of all of the new nuclear power plants that are online and planned to be built are being built by Russia, China, and India. The West is not involved in this. We haven't built a new power plant in this country since 1980. So that could change. I mean, GE has the capabilities and others do, but they're not doing it. So you have now Kenya, Nigeria, I just mentioned Rwanda, Uganda, Egypt, South Africa, have all in various phases of negotiations with Russia, China, India for nuclear power, including floating nuclear power plants, which is something I advocated for Bethlehem Steel when I ran for governor in Maryland many years ago as an alternative to shutting down Sparrows Point. So the potential is there. It's going to go ahead. It has to go ahead. I would like to see all the countries of Africa have many nuclear power plants. Right now, South Africa has 2. That's it. And there's been, despite all the problems and transition that took place in South Africa, there's no one using nuclear energy as a weapon in South Africa. So the capabilities of security are known. The recycling of the waste can bring it down to between 1% and 3% of the waste can be left over after recycling it for a fast breeder. It has medical isotopes that are used in the industry. And this is the way we have to go. We probably need 1,000 to 1,500 gigawatts of power in Africa so that Africans can live like we're living in this room. And that also gives you the capability for employment, and it gives you the capability for desalinization. So from my standpoint, nuclear energy is win, win, win. And it's going to go ahead, whether the West likes it or not. In terms of the question of China, look, a lot of people have all kinds of antagonistic views towards China. But again, you have a situation where the Western countries, again, out of their own irrationalism and pessimism about the future and development, abandoned Africa. So most of the investments that took place, don't forget, you had 500 years of slavery, was 400 years, approximately 1450 to 1850. I teach classes on this. You had another almost 100 years of colonialism, and then you had neo-colonialism under the World Bank and IMF and Paris Club. So the United States and the West abandoned Africa after liberation and the winds of change, led by Kwame Nkrumah in '57. And we didn't develop the country, except for one case I gave you with Kennedy. So then China comes in and says, we can help. And they are unique in the world. Despite all the problems, they have brought 700 million people out of poverty in 35 years. No country has ever done that in recorded history. So they have it, and how do they do it? By massive infrastructure. They have 25,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. That's more than the rest of the world combined, and they're going to double that. Are they perfect? No. Who's perfect? Nobody's perfect. But they're willing to help develop Africa and assist. So if you look at Kenya with the standard gauge, they employed 30,000 Kenyans in the standard gauge under Kenyatta's son. They've built the Djibouti-Ethiopia line, which is keeping agriculture alive in Ethiopia. They're going to put $12 billion into the Nigerian railroad line, plus 3 or 4 or 5 billion into the Mbala power plant, which Nigeria desperately needs. People say there's a debt problem, a debt trap. Not true. The debt trap is on the western side. The British-based Jubilee Debt Committee came out with their figures. 20% of African debt is owed to China. 32% of African external debt is owed to private lenders, and 35% is owed to multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the Paris Club. The debt's not there. People say China is only using its own labor. That's not true. If you look at the McKinsey report 2017, Lions and Dragons, the dance of the Lions and Dragons, they found that the majority of companies, Chinese companies, are small, private Chinese companies. The big ones, China Power, all those represent 16%. They estimate there's 10,000 privately owned Chinese companies that are employing 3 million Africans. They did a survey of 1,000 companies, and these companies in the survey employ 89% of their labor is from Africa. So in the beginning, I think the Chinese got it wrong. They've changed it, and the statistics are there. So this potential is really saving Africa. This new Silk Road is a new paradigm of countries working together for common interest of mankind. Everybody wins, everybody's trying to make money, but in the process we're raising up the standard of living of all people. The fact that the United States, first under Obama and all the presidents, but Obama was during the Silk Road period, would not join the Silk Road. Trump has not joined the Silk Road, even though he has some friendly relations with Xi. This is a mistake. This is a big mistake. But nevertheless, the new manifold is going ahead without the West. So it's up to the West to realize its mistakes and change. But again, this is all the sour milk, as they call it, crying. Yeah. It's all whining by the West, because no one is going to stop the new Silk Road. No one is going to stop Xi read his speeches. This is what they're committed to. So if we were intelligent, and I write memos to presidents all the time in this country, they don't listen to me, but they're all on my website. We were intelligent and we were wise, like Roosevelt and Kennedy were, we would be involved in this. As pointed out by all our speakers, the amount of deficit in infrastructure in Africa is so large that all countries can share in joint development, and we wouldn't be in a zero-sum game. There is no zero-sum game in China, at least for the next 50 years. If you look at the amount of steel, the amount of electricity, the amount of wire, the amount of roads, the amount of books, the amount of libraries, the amount of schools, the amount of hospitals, housing, you add up the bill of material, it's beyond anyone's calculation. This is what Africa needs. Any allies willing to help them should be encouraged. And from my standpoint, we can all share and work together for joint economic development, including space exploration. And now there's several African countries beginning to put up satellites, which is another great area of bringing science and technology and training more skilled labor and more scientists. This is all out there for us to do if we have the will and the commitment to do it, and we can shake some sense into our Western leaders.
So we have the
So you asked the question what it is about Africans getting together and understanding the free movement of people. And it's sort of like the chicken egg who came first, because as the continent pushed forward with the trade agreement and the common market and all the language limitations around it, we cannot be serious if we are not looking about how people are going to get around and how people are going to participate. That should really be the driving factor of this conversation. So that leaves a lot of questions about how the Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to be successful if we are not having an honest conversation on the continental level as to how are we going to address this challenge. When you look at the protocol that was adopted in 2018, I mean, under normal circumstances, everyone should have been, that should have even been adopted and ratified before the
AFCTA.
Exactly.
That's right.
Because you are going to need people.
That's right.
And the people we are talking about are not the people who are seated at the table negotiating the trading services, the IP protocol, and all those. Who are you negotiating for?
It's the services and the goods.
Exactly.
Because
So
it's about people.
you need to create a market, and that market needs to have consumers, and that consumers are going to be the African living in Africa. There are rising middle income in different countries. There are levels that are in the very low level of wages, but each one of them is a consumer. About a year ago, I was in Nairobi, and I was looking for a cream that I use for my hair. It's made in South Africa. So thinking that in Nairobi, South Africa, I should find one there. I went to about 5 different places. All of them are mega malls in the Nairobi suburb areas. Everybody said, oh, go to the store, you'll find it. And I couldn't find it there. I went to Ghana and I showed the picture to someone and said, oh, go to Mokola. You'll find it in Mokola. And Mokola is a just big marketplace, where people sell different things. So in my mind, I said, how am I finding this here in Mokola? And I can't find it in any of the shops in Nairobi, Kenya. It doesn't make any sense. And because I have to get it from Ghana in Mokola, the price was almost about 35–40% from when I've asked friends in South Africa to purchase it for me. That can't continue, it's not sustainable. So back to your question, the continental free trade cannot be successful, and I'm just waiting on at which point the negotiators and the policymakers will come to terms with that it will not be successful without addressing the free movement of people issue. They had the African Cup of Nations recently this summer in Egypt. And when you watched the game, there was a lot of empty seats in the stadium. There were a lot of complaints that Africans could not get visas to go to Egypt. It is the African Cup of Nations, and Africans can't get visas to go to Egypt to watch the game. Why? So you stage a whole continental tournament and invite the rest of the world to come and watch. But the people that live on the continent will have to stay at home and watch it on television. That does not make any sense. It's a loss of economic opportunity, tourism opportunity, friendliness among the nations. It was lost. So as different things happens, whether it's the West African in ECOWAS, whether it's the South Africans in SADC, whether it's the North Africans in whichever alliance different countries choose to belong to, the continental free trade becomes an absolute joke. It becomes one of the many, many documents that has not been implemented, that has not realized any benefits. If we don't have these honest conversations about the reality on the ground, if we don't build from the grounds up and we just sit at the high table and discuss all this prettiness and just put all the big words in there and form about how many pages worth of documents. So I'm not sure the issue as to why can't we get it together. That is not an easy thing. There's complexities. So I'm not going to be naive about it and say that let's all sit together at a table and be happy, right? There is complexities, there is challenges, there are histories that needs to be addressed. But the thing is, we have to take the initiative and start having those conversations openly and honestly, so that we would forge a path towards driving the Continental Free Trade Agreement together with the free movement of people, because all the economics, all the health, the security goes hand in hand with the migration problems as well. And you talked about automation and how that is going to impact
on the unskilled labor, because with the youth we have the underemployment that's driving this, but there's also the unskilled labor. In other words, given the exigencies of the fourth industrial revolution, which is what we have right now, and the move towards artificial intelligence, and automation, even in the US, the statistics shows that, but we don't know if it's going to happen, because when computers were going to be made, people were worried that it may actually displace humans in terms of jobs. But now the prediction is it's going to do the same in the US by how many percent? Some predicted within the next decade or two by maybe 15% will be displaced. If you go to your regular grocery store right now, you don't need cashiers anymore. You can just use the automated self-help kind of thing. So there's intelligence assistance, there's also intelligence replacement. No doubt about it, technology and automation and all that. Automation in factories is useful. It facilitates. It's actually helped humans to improve. Everybody has Siri, right, in your iPhone. It's a good thing. It facilitates business relations, facilitates communications amongst people. But then there's also the intelligence replacement, which is, in other words, that kind of technology or intelligence that's produced that actually replaces jobs, like robots, like a Columbia University professor they are currently making a device that produces very upscale gourmet food. He actually believes that it's a good thing. However, he's cautioning that it might replace chefs.
I'm still driving my own car.
You're not okay.
I'm driving my own car.
That's right, for now, right? I have friends who have, you know the car I'm talking about. Yeah. But still, that's the question. Technology is good. Should we start, what role does the government play in terms of R&D in actually promoting the nature of intelligence innovation that's being produced out there? In other words, innovation is good, but is there a way of incentivizing entrepreneurs in this field to produce the kind of intelligence that's really useful to the extent where it doesn't quite replace labor. Because if we get to I like Siri. Come on now. I can't, be hypocritical here. I like those kind of intelligence assistants, but you know the difference, right, between the intelligence assistants and intelligence replacement. So are there ways in which, given the exigencies of the statistics we have for Africa, what's going to happen to
will have access to these facilities to be part of that, but you're leaving a whole large population behind. The same way that we left a whole lot of people behind in the villages and made farming unattractive so they come in. So I think that part of being conscious about automation so that it doesn't render the African youth irrelevant or does not render the labor market inaccessible is for us to look at the opportunities in the sector of automation, right? I was reading a book recently and the author talks about how as human beings, we don't even use about more than 5% or so of our brains. So if I'm not doing legal work, what else can I do? Recessions had challenged economies to rethink and redevelop opportunities. Out of recessions, you've had entrepreneurs come out. How do we train, and I go back also to the curriculum, how do we train students to think about problem solving, not just to go into the market and put a resume down and look for jobs, but how do you train them to look at particular problems in their neighborhood, in their city, and say that if I get 5, 10 people together, this is what we can solve. We look at Silicon Valley with the young millionaires, with Facebook and other things, friends coming together, solving problems. It might be very, very menial in the beginning, but it changes and then it becomes something that becomes useful to society. So we have to look at automation in terms of those, and we have a good example with agriculture. Right now, there are young people who are abandoning corporate world and going back to farming. During the UN General Assembly, someone sent me an email of this young guy whose father is a pineapple farmer in Ghana, and he's taken over that business. He has a university degree, a master's degree, and he has a large pineapple farm. Not only is he making produce, but they have also scaled so that they use the pineapple pulps to make fibers. So that's another area. He's hiring people, and the business has expanded about 4 times more than when his father was just cultivating pineapple and selling to market. So we need to look into those opportunities, encourage people like that to continue working, government-assisted funds, private investment to connect them to build and to scale forward. That is how we are going to solve the issue of automation so people are not sitting down idle. Because the flip side of that is when you have the youth sitting idle, Boko Haram is active. All these terrorist organizations, they say the devil finds work for the idle hands. So they will find work. It would not be the work that we want them to find. So it is important as policymakers, as leaders, to really drive the agenda and not only look at just the unemployment or the displaced, but really look at it in practical terms as to how it affects all of us individually and then collectively as well.
That's wonderful because, yes, you can.
I wanted to ask you one question. Do you see, when we looked at what happened a while back in South Africa, when we looked at what happened in South Africa with Zimbabweans were pushed out, and then we looked at the same in South Africa with Nigerians and so forth, how much of a role do you think the economy plays? Because if you don't have jobs, for enough for your youth, and then someone comes in, even though he may not be or she may not be the cause of your problem, your anger is focused on that way. So, I mean, South Africa is facing a horrible, horrible situation of unemployment, and ghettos are growing faster and faster. So isn't that also a factor that produces this prejudice or racial
Yeah,
attitude?
she mentioned that.
Oh yeah, that is very well central of it, because part of it is looking at all these foreigners with small-scale businesses, but they are doing well. Meanwhile, you don't have anything, and you believe, I'm South African, I'm sitting here South African. How is the Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Zimbabwean here and making money at my expense? So you begin to think in terms of that for Larry being here, I could have had that. Meanwhile, you've never even thought about doing what they are doing. So even though it had nothing to do with the foreigner who is in there, but because of your own lack of opportunities and distress and economic difficulties, you begin to look at your neighbor as your enemy.
Right.
So that plays a lot of role in that.
That's right. And just to add on to the what you were saying, Joyce, we were actually at a meeting 2 days ago that the AUD NEPAD held here at GW, but in a different location. And they're actually looking at this youth unemployment question as a very critical issue. And they're bringing people, farmers and people from other regions of the world in terms of incentivizing the youth to find vocational kind of jobs to be sexier. In other words, farming and jobs that are normally plumbing and all those kind of jobs. They're actually bringing wealthy people from the West that are in the field of vocational training and education kind of jobs to forums where they include youth from Africa to expose them to how fruitful and valuable those jobs are. In other words, you don't have to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a physician if you're from, if you're in Africa. Most Africans want their kids to be doctors, lawyers, and professionals, as opposed to being farmers or, plumbers or construction workers. So that's one of the things they're doing. So I want to throw questions out there because we will go on forever. So at this stage, what I'm going to be doing is asking the audience if any of you have questions, and then I'll summarize, and that will be, if you have additional questions, then you can ask speakers and ask me questions at the end, but that will be the end of our session after that. I see a hand up there, yes, the lady, yeah?
Ordered in Geneva, and that tackles child trafficking in sport. So mine is just a general question and more probably an observation, which is that I think at the root of all this is the educational system in Africa, which is still, in my opinion, based on structures 40, 50 years ago that are not necessarily relevant to the current state of economics. And probably that needs to be something that there needs to be a reform, a widespread reform across the continent. In Switzerland, for instance, I can give you an example where they have 2 tractions to a professional career. Up until high school, you have the opportunity to either go on to college based on your examinations and based on your interests, and then the other option is to go through the apprenticeship section, which is you finish high school and then you're engaged either in a bank or some kind of vocational activity, but they have a structure. So there are some banks, there are some architectural firms, law firms that have a program where high school students can then enter into those firms and then start at entry level and climb up the ladder. You have CEOs.
Thanks for sharing. Do you have a question?
No, I'm just making.
Why is Africa not doing that too?
Well, the question, it's a general comment, being that probably I see it as a question of education,
yes,
and that we.
I think Joyce had.
Issues in relationship to Africa's future development. And I've got so many questions I want to ask each of you, but I can't do that, as you said, for the sake of time right now, Eric. but I'm going to bring them up in the next session. There was a question you asked which was so pertinent, and I'd like each of you to respond to it. You didn't say anything quite succinct with it. And that question was, does Africa need China? And I'm going to elaborate on it at the next session. But would either or each of you respond? And Mr. Freeman, I could not be more pleased. You hit on every essential right of what Africa has to do. Infrastructure creates employment opportunity for the whole of Africa. Wherever a railroad goes, new road going and new homes spring up. New businesses become a reality. And what Ms. Bright just said is essential. And I'm going to ask you to come up when I get up here. When you have trafficking amongst children, and that's the future of the whole, not just of Africa, but globally, that will change the dichotomy as it exists today. But each of you, please answer that singular question. Does Africa need China? Very important.
Thank you.
What about, I mean, if you look at, first of all, I'm an American, and one of the biggest things I did was I got to run maybe all U.S. trade operations in Western Europe. I wrote market studies and so forth and so forth. And so that was probably the thing. But one of the things is that, one, there's no labor mobility between U.S., Mexico, The Europeans are doing it. The Africans are thinking about it. And it fits into the analysis. Is that essential? And then this is another item I saw. I said, look, I'm just going to, and I think, is that essential? The other day, someone handed me a picture of Mercedes on a German port. And, Mercedes are exported from Germany. And I looked at the article. No, they were Mercedes made in the U.S. being shipped to Germany for shipping around Europe. And I said, hey, that's true. I'm an auto negotiator for the U.S. We were successful. What did we do? We looked at our analysis. We brought in people like you. What do we need to do to make this and make this a successful industry for jobs in South Dakota and so forth and so forth? And it may have been labor mobility, and whether you think it or not, you are all U.S. workers. And so, is labor mobility essential to that, and how is Africa going to get there? But it's not, it may be between, well, I don't know.
Mobility, and both of us can do the China because in the interest of time. The question Dr. Bland asked is a very critical question because I had asked that of Larry when he was presenting. To me, the question is not whether or not we need China. I don't mean to look like I'm answering a question with a question. There's no continent. It's like there's no country that's an island. When we talk about, that's why we're sitting here, it's about trade. Intra-Africa trade only comprises of 10% of goods and globally manufactured goods and services. Intra, that's within Africa, only 10%. So that tells you they're already trading a lot with foreign countries, be it in terms of using China for infrastructure development, or trading with China, or trading with the US, or trading with Britain, wherever. Because at the continental level, likewise, the same way we can say nations are now an island, it's like an incestuous relationship we all have with each other. Because there's technological advancement of planes and whatever. In the past, maybe 200, 300 years, the slaves were brought here in a ship, right? And it took them 3 months, 4 months to get, I don't know. But now you can easily get to South Africa in 12 hours or whatever. So it's going to be difficult. Realistically, yes, Africa cannot do. The question to me is, Africa can't do without any other country, but the question is, can Africa actually capitalize on the competitive donor advantage that they have right now in terms of a lot of cooks, development cooks, trade cooks that are interested in trading with Africa or negotiating with Africa? Africa has a lot of external interventions, be it China, Britain, EU, USA, Canada, name it. most of Europe. They want to negotiate or trade with Africa. Will Africa, in terms of governance, get its act together to have political will? The Continental Free Trade Area provides that opportunity for Africa to decide what comparative advantage do we have in terms of goods and services. If we need China, how can we better engage China, be it in terms of providing aid or finance or technical assistance, whatever. It should be non-zero sum, not a zero-sum game. There's nothing wrong with having 60-40 in terms of zero sum, but there's a problem if it's 99% and 1%. That's when there's a problem, because you have to be able to negotiate effectively to know what you have. Leveraging, that's what the real issue is, be it with China or US or wherever. And I think Larry...
Well, objectively,
Can we limit it to 1 minute, please, in terms of your response? I know,
I'm a
Freeman.
panelist.
No, excuse me, we came in very late. You missed the whole morning, so you can't. And I'm not very pleased, Mary, that you brought him here, because I'm the moderator for this. And the other panel was very late in leaving, and you didn't do the same. So
and
please,
you weren't here for that area.
Exactly. So excuse me, we need to be very polite.
Order in the house. Order in the house.
Yes, thank you. I'm the moderator.
So, Mr. Freeman, you have 2 minutes.
Excuse me,
please.
no, he doesn't
Eric,
have. I'm the moderator. He's going to talk for as long as he wants, because we were here late.
So look,
No, but
objective,
we came very late.
Objectively,
Excuse me, we were here for 1 hour waiting for the
Okay,
panel to finish.
Go ahead, Mr. Freeman.
For
You have
2
all the
hours,
time that you
actually.
need. Thank you.
objectively, you would say no, but that's not the real world. I mean, you have to take into account 500 years of slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. So why does Africa need help? Well, look at the Naira. The Naira is not traded worldwide. It's not a convertible currency. Why not? When Buhari took over first as a, quote, military administrator in '84, the Naira was worth $1.34. It was worth more than $1, 1 Naira. It was devalued continually. From 1980 to 2000, currencies in Africa were devalued, terms of trade were created, and the Western debt skyrocketed to several hundred billion of Western debt before China came involved. So the African countries need help because of what was done to them, not because of anything inherent in Africa. So we need assistance, and the assistance is going to be in long-term credit, not trying to make double-digit profits overnight, which is what the West companies want to do. They want to go in there, make investments, pull out money, or pull out extractive industry. They need long-term credit, like we had in this country. 15, 20 years, 2 to 3% interest. That gives the opportunity for the infrastructure to make an impact on the economy, and then you make the profit that can pay it back. The other area is human beings. Every human being is created in the image of God. We all, therefore, have a divine spark of creativity, which no machine, no matter what artificial intelligence does, can ever approximate the human mind, because we can make hypotheses that a machine can't make. So therefore, why not have China and Africa learn from each other's culture? And the West should be in there too. We should learn about Confucius. We should learn about the great leaders of Africa and the great cultures of Africa, the Yoruba culture, the great Zimbabwe culture, the great Bantu migration, which almost no one knows anything about, but us African historians. So we can learn, and we can learn about Plato and Socrates. So culture is coming together, sharing ideas, which all believe in the common interest of mankind is good. So whether China would be, quote, absolutely necessary for Africa, that's irrelevant. Right now, it plays a very important role. And there are 647 million people living in poverty in Africa. That's $2 a day or less. China just brought 750 million people out of poverty. So why wouldn't you naturally want to work with someone who has been successful in doing that?
Okay. So thank you, Larry. So let's have Joyce close with her answer.
So your comment was on mobility and labor, and it goes hand in hand. When people travel, they're traveling either for economic benefit, whether it's for tourism, whether it's to visit family. It all goes hand in hand. We've had a lot of conversations in this country about chain migration, whether families should be able to bring other families here by virtue of them being permanent residents or United States citizens. But as you mentioned, if Mercedes a German company, if they look at the economies of scale and the production cost in the US or anywhere in the world is cheaper and they can achieve the same thing, why not? So not only companies are going to look at different markets for production. Volkswagen recently signed an agreement to start some manufacturing and assembly in Rwanda. We're going to see more of that because every company is looking for where can we do this effectively and cheaply and increase our profits. Part of that is looking at labor in terms of wages, labor protection laws, and as my sister at the back mentioned, trafficking, not only in sports but also in manual labor and across borders. So yes, mobility and labor goes hand in hand, and people move primarily for jobs to create a better environment for their families and for themselves. So they will go where the opportunities are. It is up to us to make sure that that movement does not incapacitate them, but rather empowers them.
Thank you very much, Joyce. And I think we can close on a positive note that the AFCTA actually has a good goal, and even though there are challenges, there are opportunities, and that the African nations, the AU, is actually capitalizing on that to make sure that they overcome the challenges of human capital and also the infrastructural challenges. There are opportunities out there for Africa to take advantage of what they have and create non-zero-sum games in engaging China, US, and the EU and other countries in the process, but they have to be in the driver's seat. That's what's key. Thank you very much. By the way, we only exceeded by 5 minutes.